The most famous atrocity in Chinese history may never have happened the way you were taught. You've heard the story. An emperor so afraid of ideas that he gathered the empire's books and burned them, then took the scholars who'd written them and buried them alive. Hundreds of them, screaming, in pits outside his capital. It's the original image of tyranny. Censorship with a body count. Here's the problem. The man who wrote that story down lived 100 years after it supposedly happened. He worked for the dynasty that had overthrown the very emperor he was describing. And the way the story has come down to us, the curse those scholars threw at the emperor as the dirt came down wasn't "may you suffer." It was "may your dynasty fall," which it did, conveniently, just in time for the people telling the story to take over. That's the strange thing about the cruelest rulers in China's history. They are not hidden. They are not lost. They fill the official records, page after page, in obsessive detail. The question is not why we know so little about them. It's why we might know too much. These are 10 emperors the textbooks couldn't look away from. Some earned every word. Some were buried twice, once in the ground, once in ink. Let's find out which. To understand these men and women, you first have to understand who was holding the pen. China kept records like no other civilization on Earth. For more than 2,000 years, almost every dynasty did the same thing the moment it took power. It wrote the official history of the dynasty it had just destroyed. The Han wrote the history of the Qin, the Tang wrote the history of the Sui. The new rulers commissioned scholars, opened the archives, and produced a verdict on the people they had replaced. This created a problem that runs underneath every story you're about to hear. In Chinese political thought, an emperor ruled because heaven allowed it. This was the mandate of heaven, a kind of cosmic permission slip. A just ruler kept it. A cruel one lost it. And when a dynasty collapsed, the explanation was always the same. The last emperors had become monsters, so heaven took the mandate away and handed it to someone better. Someone like, say, the people now writing the history. So cruelty was not just gossip. It was evidence. The worse the previous emperor looked, the more legitimate the new one became. A tyrant in the records was a job qualification for his successor. This is the tension you have to hold in your head for the next 40 minutes. The brutality in these accounts was in most cases real. The Chinese histories are among the most rigorous in the pre-modern world, cross-checked, dated, and argued over by generations of scholars. But they were also written by the winners, and the winners had reasons to press harder on certain bruises than others. The records that preserve these stories have names. The records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian around 100 BCE, the foundation of the whole tradition. The Book of Northern Qi, the Book of Sui, and towering over all of them, the Ziji Tongjian, the comprehensive mirror in aid of governance, a vast chronicle compiled in the 11th century to teach emperors how to rule by showing them in unbearable detail how others had failed. That word, mirror, matters. These histories were not written to entertain you. They were written to warn the next ruler. Every flayed minister, every drowned laborer, every drunken massacre was a lesson aimed at a living emperor. Do not become this. Which means the cruelty was curated, selected, sharpened into a teaching tool. So as we go, keep one question running underneath. Is this man as bad as the page says, or exactly as bad as someone needed him to be? With some of them, you won't be able to tell. With others, the cruelty is so well documented, from so many directions, that the answer is simply, yes, he was. Let's start at the beginning, with the emperor who invented China and possibly invented the template for everyone who came after. Number 1, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor. He is the reason the word China may exist at all. And he is the reason tyrant has a face in the Chinese imagination. Before him, there was no China. There were warring kingdoms, 7 of them, grinding against each other for centuries. The king of Qin conquered them one by one, and in 221 BCE, he declared himself something no one had ever been. Not a king, but the first emperor, Shi Huangdi. He standardized the writing system, the coins, the width of cart axles, so wheels would fit every road. He connected the early defensive walls into the ancestor of what became the Great Wall. To put that in scale for a global audience, when Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, Rome was still a republic that had not yet met Hannibal. The war that would nearly destroy it was a few years off. He built one of history's first true empires, while the power that would later dominate the West was still just one city among many. But unity came at a cost measured in bodies. By the traditional reckoning, hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers died building his wall, his roads, and the colossal tomb that still hides the terracotta army, an underground guard of thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, each with a different face buried to protect him forever. And then there's the burning of the books and the burying of the scholars. In 213 BCE, on the advice of his Chancellor Liu Ziye, the emperor ordered the destruction of texts that might let people compare his rule unfavorably to the past. The next year, the story goes, he had 460 scholars executed for spreading dissent. Here's where you have to slow down, because this is the founding example of everything we discussed. The account comes from Sima Qian, writing roughly a century later, under the Han, the dynasty that had every reason to make the Qin look like a nightmare. Modern historians who've examined the text point out several cracks. The victims may not have been Confucian scholars at all, but Fangxi, court alchemists who'd promised the emperor an immortality elixir and failed to deliver. The burned everything claim is overstated. Copies of the banned books were kept in the imperial library, and the number, 460, has the suspicious roundness of a symbol rather than a count. None of this makes him gentle. He was a man who chased immortality so hard he may have poisoned himself with mercury pills, and who died on the road obsessed with not dying. His own eldest son, Fusu, begged him to show mercy to the scholars and was exiled to the frontier for it, a decision that would help destroy the dynasty within 4 years of the emperor's death. But notice what happened. The single most quoted act of cruelty in Chinese history is also one of the most disputed. The first emperor is genuinely brutal and genuinely slandered at the same time, in the same sentence. He sets the pattern. Now watch how the pattern hardens into something worse. Number 2. Empress Lü Zhi. The woman in the annals, she never took the title of emperor. But the historian who recorded her reign gave her something he reserved for emperors alone. And what she did to one rival is still, 2,000 years later, a phrase mothers use to frighten children. Lü Zhi was the wife of Liu Bang, the peasant-turned-warlord who founded the Han dynasty. When he died in 195 BCE, their delicate young son took the throne as Emperor Hui. But everyone understood who actually ruled. She did, and she had a list. At the top was Lady Qi, her husband's favorite concubine, the woman who had spent years trying to get her own son named heir instead of Lu's. With Liu Bang gone, Lü Zhi moved. She poisoned Lady Qi's son, then she turned to Lady Qi herself. Here the records become hard to read, and I'll keep it as plain as I can. She had Lady Qi's hands and feet cut off, her eyes removed, her ears destroyed, her voice silenced with a potion. Then she had what remained placed in a latrine and gave it a name, the human swine, Renji. The word survives in Chinese to this day as the definition of cruelty without a floor. Then she did something almost stranger. She invited her own son, the young emperor, to come and look at it. When he understood what he was seeing, that this had been a living woman, he is recorded as collapsing in horror and saying that this was not the act of a human being, and that as the son of such a mother, he could never govern the empire. He fell into a depression, withdrew from rule entirely, and died young. Lü Zhi simply governed on without him, installing infant emperors as needed. Here's the detail that says the most. When Sima Qian came to write his history decades later, he placed Lü Zhi in the Benji, the basic annals, the chapters reserved exclusively for the sovereigns who actually ruled China. He skipped right over her puppet child emperors. In the cold judgment of the greatest Chinese historian, she was not a wife who meddled. She was the ruler. He counted her among the emperors. So when we ask who was too brutal for the history books, she's the answer the history books couldn't even categorize. But cruelty in the palace is one thing. Cruelty as official policy written into law is another. For that, we travel 3 centuries forward, to the end of the 3 kingdoms. Number 3, Sun Hao, the last king of Wu He, answered the question, did you really flay people's faces? Out loud at a dinner party to the man who had just conquered him. And his answer is one of the coldest sentences in the records. Sun Hao was the grandson of Sun Quan, the great founder of the Eastern Wu, one of the 3 kingdoms whose rivalry has been retold in China for 17 centuries. When Sun Hao took the throne in 264, he started well. He opened the granaries, freed palace women, cut taxes. For a moment, people hoped. The moment didn't last. Sun Hao became suspicious, then extravagant, then sadistic. The records credit him with a personal menu of punishments, gouging out eyes and peeling the skin from people's faces, the 2 his own conquerors would later throw back at him. He killed officials who displeased him, and family members he feared. He filled his harem with thousands of women while his kingdom rotted. In 280, the rising Jin dynasty came south and Wu collapsed. Sun Hao surrendered, bound, and smeared with mud in the traditional gesture of a defeated king. And here is the scene the historians could not resist preserving. At the Jin court, an official named Jia Chong decided to humiliate him. I hear, he said, that in the south you gouged out men's eyes and peeled the skin from their faces. What kind of punishment is that? The conquered ruined Sun Hao did not flinch. He answered, That was the punishment for a subject who plotted against his sovereign. It is a chilling reply precisely because it isn't a denial. He doesn't say, I never did that. He says those people deserved it. He never tried to hide the flaying. To him, it wasn't a crime to conceal, it was justice, correctly applied. There's a smaller version of the same story, where Sun Hao watches a Jin minister playing chess with his legs stretched out under the table, and the minister, hearing Sun Hao describe foot amputation as a routine penalty, quietly pulls his leg back in. Sun Hao's cruelty followed him into captivity as a kind of dark reputation that emptied rooms. He died a marquis in the enemy's capital 3 years later, the last king of Wu, the man who ended the three kingdoms, not in glory but in surrender. And yet, for all the horror, Sun Hao loses a kingdom and a few hundred lives. The next man on this list loses count. Number 4, Shi Hu. The Tiger of Zhao, his name literally means stone tiger. He ruled during the bloodiest, most chaotic stretch of Chinese history, and even by the standards of that era, an era where mass slaughter was ordinary, contemporaries singled him out as something else. The 4th century was the time of the 16 kingdoms, when the unified empire shattered and northern China became a churn of short-lived states led by warlords, many of them from nomadic peoples on the frontier. Shi Hu belonged to the Jie people, and he rose as a brilliant, almost unbeaten general for the later Zhao state before seizing it for himself in a coup in 334. As a commander, he was genuinely gifted. As a ruler, he was a furnace that consumed everything around it. He conscripted hundreds of thousands of people for palaces, hunting parks, and pointless megaprojects, working them to death. He built enormous pleasure grounds, stocked them with game, and ringed his realm with savage laws. The chroniclers say he applied his penal code, as a rule, with deliberate and exaggerated harshness. He treated his own subjects as raw material. But it's inside his own family that the story reaches its worst. Shi Hu raised sons who were as violent as he was, and then was shocked when they turned on each other. His first heir plotted to assassinate him and was executed. His second heir, Sichuan, murdered his own younger brother Shitao out of jealousy. What Shi Hu did to that second son in response was so extreme that even the chroniclers, accustomed to atrocity, recorded it as a mark of a broken mind. He had Sichuan brought out and put to death by methods designed to last, and then ordered the boy's entire household killed alongside him, a father erasing a son, and the son's children, and the son's servants all at once. Here's the thing that makes Shi Hu's story land. The cruelty didn't even buy him stability. The moment he died in 349, his sons and grandsons fell into a war of succession so vicious it destroyed the state within 2 years. His own adopted grandson, a man named Ran Min, turned against the dynasty and ordered the massacre of the Jie people, the very ethnic group Shi Hu had ruled in the name of. He spent a lifetime building a machine of fear. It outlived him by 24 months. Remember that, because we're going to see it again. The discovery that terror is a terrible foundation. But first, the youngest monster on this list. He was barely old enough to shave. Number 5, Liu Ziye. The teenage emperor, he took the throne as a teenager, ruled for less than 18 months, and packed into that year and a half enough violence to earn a permanent place in the chronicles. His own dying mother's last words about him are some of the bleakest a parent has ever spoken. The Liu Song dynasty ruled southern China from the glittering capital of Jiankang, the city that would later become Nanjing. When the emperor died in 464, his son Liu Ziye inherited everything at around 15. When an official handed him the imperial seal, the boy took it carelessly, without a flicker of grief, and the man who handed it over reportedly turned to a colleague and said this would not end well. It did not. Liu Ziye began killing the senior officials he distrusted, including relatives. He was obsessed with the fact that both his grandfather and father had been third sons who'd seized power, and he grew paranoid that his own brothers and uncles would do the same to him. Records describe a young man unraveling in real time. He kept his aunts and female relatives in the palace and forced himself on them. When one aunt refused him, he is said to have executed her 3 sons in retaliation. He put a lady-in-waiting to death because she resembled a woman who had cursed him in a dream. Killed for an image in his own sleep. And then there's his mother. As she lay dying, she sent for him. He refused to come, reportedly saying that sick people's rooms were full of ghosts and he couldn't risk it. His mother, hearing this, is recorded as telling her servants to bring her a sword and cut her open so she could see how on earth she had given birth to such a creature. That line survives because someone thought it captured him perfectly. A mother who would rather be cut apart than understand her own son. He didn't last. One of the uncles he'd been so afraid of finally moved against him, and Liu Ziye was assassinated before he turned 18. The man who killed him took the throne himself, and immediately ordered Liu Ziye's brother and sister, who'd shared in his cruelties, to take their own lives. A teenager with absolute power and no restraint at all. It's the rawest version of the problem these histories keep circling. Now meet the version that's almost theatrical. An emperor whose court had to keep a supply of human beings on hand, just in case. Number 6. Gao Yang, Emperor Wenxuan of northern Qi. For the first few years, he was one of the most effective rulers of his century. By the end, his own prime minister kept a stock of condemned prisoners in the palace, specifically so the emperor would have someone to kill when the urge struck him while drunk. Gao Yang founded the northern Qi in 550. As a child, he'd been dismissed as slow, possibly because he was deliberately playing dumb to survive a dangerous family, and when his moment came, he seized power with startling skill. Early in his reign, he was sharp and energetic. He strengthened the army, equalized taxes, and paid his officials properly to reduce corruption. The state was strong. People who'd written him off were stunned. Then the drinking took him, and a darkness the records attribute to both alcohol and something like untreated mental illness. The competent founder became, in the chronicler's words, a beast. He killed compulsively. He turned on his own family, relatives, and in-laws alike. The histories record him loosing an arrow at his own mother-in-law and having her whipped. They describe him roaming the markets of the capital, Yecheng, half-dressed with a bow and a sword, looking for someone to hurt. He grew so murderous when drunk that his court faced a practical problem. The emperor wanted to kill people, and running out of people was not an option. So the prime minister, Yang Yin, built a system. He kept a pool of condemned criminals housed in the palace. When the emperor demanded a victim, a prisoner was produced for him to kill. And in a detail that tells you everything about how routine this had become, there was a rule. If one of these condemned men managed to survive 3 months in the palace without being killed, he was set free. The emperor's bloodlust had been turned into a grim lottery, with administrators keeping score. The single most infamous story concerns a favorite concubine from the Shu family. In a drunken rage over a perceived slight, Gao Yang killed her. Then, in the episode the traditional histories preserve most vividly, he is said to have taken a bone from her body and worked it into a pepa, a stringed instrument, and sat at a feast playing it and singing that a beautiful woman is hard to find again. His drinking killed him in 559, not yet 35. And like Shi Hu before him, the terror didn't hold. His teenage son was murdered by an uncle within months, and the northern Qi he'd built so brilliantly was conquered and extinguished less than 20 years later. That's 2 founders now, Shi Hu, Gao Yang, who were genuinely capable men, who built strong states, and whose cruelty hollowed those states out from the inside. Hold that thought, because the next emperor built something so useful it's still in use today, and people are still arguing about whether he was a monster or a martyr. Number 7, Yang Guang, Emperor Yang of Sui. He may have murdered his father to take the throne. He drowned a generation of his own people in forced labor. And he is also the reason a 1,000-mile artificial river still carries cargo across China in the 21st century. No emperor on this list splits historians more cleanly down the middle. The Sui dynasty reunified China in 589 after centuries of division, an achievement on the scale of putting Humpty Dumpty back together. Yang Guang was the second Sui emperor. He reached the throne in 604 after framing his older brother to get himself named heir, and according to the traditional accounts, possibly after having his ailing father strangled or poisoned in his sickbed. The records are not gentle with him. What he did next was monstrous in its arithmetic. He launched gigantic public works simultaneously. He rebuilt the eastern capital at Luoyang. He extended the Great Wall. And above all, he drove the construction of the Grand Canal, a waterway linking the Yellow River and the Yangtze, stitching the wealthy south to the political north. The human cost is staggering even by the standards of this video. Over a few years, the canal projects conscripted somewhere north of 3 million laborers. By the traditional accounts, more than half of them died, worked to death in the mud, their bodies a foundation under the most ambitious infrastructure project in the medieval world. Then he spent the rest of his treasury and his manpower on 3 catastrophic invasions of the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, mobilizing millions more and losing. The empire broke, rebellions ignited everywhere. In 618, his own guard commander had him strangled, and the Sui dynasty, barely a generation old, was finished. So far so tyrant. Here's where it gets complicated. A growing number of historians argue that Yang Guang has been, in a phrase that follows him around, maligned for 1,000 years. The dynasty that overthrew him, the Tang, wrote his history, and the Tang became one of the greatest dynasties in Chinese civilization. They had every incentive to paint their predecessor as a debauched lunatic whose fall was deserved. And the canal he killed so many people to build? It became the economic spine of China for the next 1,300 years. It is still in use. In 2014, it was named a World Heritage Site. Cities like Hangzhou and Yangzhou grew rich on it. So which is he? The butcher who drowned 3 million people in a ditch? Or the visionary who paid an unbearable price for something that outlasted every dynasty that mocked him? The honest answer is that he is both, and that the records can't fully separate the man from the propaganda. That uncertainty isn't a gap in the story, it is the story, and it leads directly to the most contested figure of them all, the one ruler on this list whose cruelty might be, in part, the crime of having been born the wrong gender. Number 8, Wu Zetian. The only female emperor, she is the only woman in more than 2,000 years to rule China not as a wife, not as a regent, but as emperor in her own name. The histories call her a poisoner, a child killer, a spy master who ruled by terror. And out of more than 200 emperors, she is just about the only one judged, primarily for the murders, rather than the reign. Wu Zetian entered the palace as a teenage concubine and clawed her way up through 2 emperors' courts with extraordinary intelligence and nerve. By 690, she had pushed her own sons aside, declared a new dynasty, the Zhou, and taken the title Huangdi, emperor, the full thing. No one had ever done it before. No one would ever do it again. The charges against her are severe. She is accused of eliminating rivals without mercy, including members of her own family. She built a network of secret informants and a corps of cruel investigators who used torture to extract confessions. Officials lived in fear of a knock at the door, a denunciation of forced suicide. The atmosphere of dread in her court is one of the darkest things in the Tang records. Here's the complication that modern historians keep raising. Wu Zetian's history was written by men, in a culture built on the Confucian principle that women must not rule. To them, a woman on the throne wasn't just a political problem. It was a violation of the natural order of heaven itself, and the surviving accounts of her reign are saturated with that horror. The uncomfortable test scholars now apply is simple. Was she actually bloodier than her male counterparts? Eliminating rivals, purging the disloyal, even killing kin, that was, depressingly, standard practice for emperors of either sex. Many male rulers did worse and are remembered as great. Wu Zetian did roughly what ambitious emperors did, and she is remembered as a monster. The gap between those two judgments is hard to explain by anything other than her gender, and yet she was demonstrably effective. She expanded the examination system that let talented commoners enter government, weakening the grip of the old aristocracy. Her empire was stable, well-run, and prosperous. She was eventually pushed out in her 80s, in a coup, and the Tang dynasty resumed as if her years had been an interruption. She left one final haunting thing. Her tomb at Qianling is marked by an enormous stone stele, and it is completely blank. No inscription, no record of her achievements. Why it's blank, no one can prove. The reading that has stuck, and it's a hard one to resist, is that she left it wordless on purpose, handing the verdict to later generations rather than writing her own. We can't know that was her intent, but coming from a woman who understood better than almost anyone who controls the record, an empty stone is difficult to read as an accident. It might be the most honest monument on this entire list, an empty page, from a woman who knew exactly who would be holding the pen. We've now crossed 1,500 years. For the last 2, we arrive at the dynasty most associated with China's golden age, and discover that even there, behind the porcelain and the poetry, the machinery of terror ran at full speed. Number 9. The Hongwu Emperor. Yuanzhang, he was born a starving peasant, lost most of his family to famine and plague, begged as a wandering monk, and rose by his own hand to found the Ming dynasty, one of the most remarkable life stories in human history. Then, having reached the top, he turned on the people who'd helped him get there and killed them by the tens of thousands. There is genuinely no rise like it. Yuanzhang went from beggar to rebel soldier to warlord to emperor in about 16 years, threw the Mongol Yuan dynasty out of China, and in 1368 took the reign name Hongwu. For a man who'd watched his parents die of starvation, the achievement was almost mythic. But the famine never left him. He trusted no one. He'd been an illiterate peasant, and he was convinced the educated scholar officials around him were laughing at him behind their classical phrases. He'd known hunger, and he was sure his ministers were stealing. In 1380, he accused his own chancellor, Hu Weiyang, of treason and executed him. That was the beginning, not the end. The investigation metastasized. Anyone connected to Hu Weiyang came under suspicion, and the purge spread through the government for more than a decade. By modern estimates, the related purges killed tens of thousands of people, By some counts, approaching 100,000. Officials, their families, their associates, swept up and put to death. One historian put it starkly. Hongwu's purges inflicted a deeper trauma on China's educated elite than anything the Mongols had ever done. The man who claimed to have liberated China from foreign rule did more damage to its own scholars than the foreigners had, and his methods were designed to terrify. He created a Sikh police force, the embroidered uniform guard, that answered only to him, with a mandate to watch everyone and forgive nothing. He rewrote the law to be far harsher than the standard code, expanding the list of capital crimes past 1,000. The punishment for corruption became almost unbelievable. An official who embezzled past a set amount of silver, roughly 60 taels, was to be beheaded, then flayed. His skin was stuffed with straw and put on public display, often in a small structure beside the local government office, so that the next official to sit at that desk would work all day beside the stuffed hide of his predecessor. A scarecrow made of a man as a management technique. Chinese scholars have debated the details of these flaying accounts for centuries, and some are likely exaggerated. But the legal code is real, and the intent behind it is unmistakable. Hongwu wanted every official in China to feel watched and to feel afraid. He built a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. He also built the template for paranoid, centralized, terror-backed rule that his own descendants would use against each other. One of those descendants is our final emperor, and he learned the lesson well. Number 10, the Yongle Emperor. Zhu He gave the world the Forbidden City and the great treasure fleets that sailed to Africa. He also invented a punishment so extreme it had never existed before in Chinese law and never would again, and he created it on the spot because one stubborn scholar dared him to. Zhu Di was one of Hongwu's sons, a hardened military prince stationed in the north. When his father died, the throne passed not to him but to a teenage nephew, the Wenxuan Emperor. Zhu Di refused to accept it. He launched a civil war, marched on the capital at Nanjing in 1402, and seized the throne as the Yongle Emperor. His nephew vanished in the flames of the burning palace, a body too charred to identify, and rumors for centuries that he'd escaped disguised as a monk. A usurper needs legitimacy. So Yongle summoned the most respected scholar of the age, Fang Xiaoru, and ordered him to write the official proclamation announcing the new reign. It was a formality. Fang's signature would tell the whole empire that the learned class accepted the new emperor. Fang refused. When pressed, he took the brush and wrote 4 characters. The usurper has stolen the throne. Yongle, enraged, threatened him with the worst penalty in the legal tradition: the extermination of the 9 kinships, the execution of 9 degrees of a man's relatives, parents to grandchildren, to wipe his bloodline off the earth. And Fang Xiaoru, knowing exactly what he was saying, replied, "Never mind 9, make it 10. So Yongle invented a 10th. He added a category that had never existed: Fang's students and colleagues, his intellectual family. In the only recorded extermination of 10 kinships in Chinese history, around 873 people are said to have been executed for the crime of one man's loyalty. Fang's relatives, his friends, his pupils, killed because he would not sign a piece of paper. The brutality reached into his own household too. Late in his reign, after a scandal involving a favorite concubine, Yongle is said to have ordered a massacre of palace women on an enormous scale. By one surviving account from a woman who was there, in the thousands. Anyone who might have known the secret was eliminated. And yet this same man moved the capital to Beijing and built the Forbidden City, the vast palace complex that stood at the heart of Chinese power for 5 centuries and draws millions of visitors today. He sponsored the treasure voyages of the Admiral Zheng He, fleets so large they reached the coast of East Africa decades before any Europeans sailed there. The walls of the Forbidden City and the legend of those ships are his monuments. That's the pattern, complete. The same hands that ordered 873 deaths over a refused signature also built one of the wonders of the world, Splendor and Slaughter, signed by the same name. So we've met our 10. But there's a question we've been circling the whole time, and it's time to answer it directly. Why do we know all of this? Think about it. These are not crimes that came to light through some leaked document or a brave investigator. They are written, in detail, in the official histories, the books each dynasty commissioned to record the truth. The cruelty isn't hidden in the archive, it is the archive, and that should make you suspicious in a useful way. Because the people who wrote these accounts almost always benefited from them. The Han needed the Qin to be tyrannical to justify replacing it. The Tang needed Yang Guang to be a debauched madman to make their own rise look like heaven's will. The Confucian historians needed Wu Zetian to be a monster to prove a woman should never sit on the throne. So we get a spectrum. At one end, emperors like Sun Hao and Shi Hu and Gao Yang, whose cruelty is corroborated from so many angles, in such consistent detail, that the simplest explanation is that it's true. At the other end, figures like Guang and Zetian, where you can almost watch the propaganda being layered on, where the worst stories appear suspiciously well-timed to flatter the next regime. And in the strange middle sits Qin Shi Huang, where we started, genuinely brutal and genuinely exaggerated in the very same breath. His most famous atrocity, a true event wrapped in a century of useful embellishment. Here's what survives, and it isn't only the horror. The Grand Canal still moves freight today. The Forbidden City still stands. The examination system Wu Zetian expanded shaped Chinese government for over 1,000 years. The word renji still means cruelty without a bottom. The first emperor's standardized script is, in its descendants, the writing still used by more than 1 billion people. These rulers left real things in the world, alongside the bodies. But the deepest legacy is the lesson the Ziji Tongzhen was built to teach, the one its title hides in plain sight, a mirror in aid of governance. These stories were preserved not to disgust you, but to instruct the next person with power. Every flayed minister was a warning. Every drowned laborer was a lesson. The cruelty was written down so that it might not have to happen again. And one time, just once on this list, the people on the receiving end of all that cruelty decided not to wait for the historians to avenge them. It's 1542. The Ming Dynasty, the same dynasty Hongwu founded and Yongle expanded. The Jiajing Emperor sleeps in the chamber of a favored consort, deep inside Yongle's forbidden city. He is a cruel man, even by the standard of this video. He's obsessed with a Taoist elixir of immortality brewed, in part from the blood of young girls. And so the palace keeps girls of 13 and 14, feeding them only mulberry leaves and dew to keep them pure, beating them for the smallest fault, discarding them when they sicken. On this night, 16 of those palace women move against him, and why they did, the sources never quite settle. The red lead cruelty, a quieter feud inside the harem, plain survival. The records keep their desperation far more clearly than their reasons. What isn't in doubt is what they do next. They wait until the emperor is asleep. They slip a silk cord around his neck. And for the first time in any of these stories, the victims are the ones holding the rope. It should have worked. But in the dark, terrified, one of them ties the noose into a knot that catches and won't pull tight. The emperor wakes, choking but alive. One girl loses her nerve and runs to alert the empress. The guards come, and every one of the 16 is captured. The reprisal was everything you would expect from the dynasty of stuffed skins and 10 exterminations. The women were put to death by slow dismemberment. Their families were dragged in and executed. The machine of terror closed over them completely, and yet, for one dark hour in the most controlled space in the empire, the script flipped. The people whose suffering filled the records picked up the pen, or the cord, and tried to write a different ending. They failed by the width of a badly tied knot. That's the thing to sit with. We remember these 10 emperors because the histories made sure we would. But the histories almost never recorded the names of the people they ruled. The laborers, the concubines, the conscripts, who were the raw material of all that splendor and all that fear. The night 16 palace women nearly strangled an emperor is one of the only times those people step out of the margins and into the center of the story, with names of their own. The cruelty got remembered, they mostly didn't. That imbalance is the real subject of every story you just heard. So here's where I'll leave you. Of these 10, which one do you think earned their reputation, and which one was buried twice, once in the ground and once in ink, by the people who replaced them? Drop the name in the comments, and tell me what tipped you one way or the other. If stories like this are why you're here, the channel goes deeper into each of these worlds one video at a time. You're welcome to come along for the next one.